All right, so we are on to the last topic for respiratory anatomy, which is a brief trip through the basic histology of the lung. Um, the lung is a really cool tissue histologically. Sorry, I left out one. We're also going to talk about the trachea, and that actually comes first. So let me just get the trachea out of the way first. The trachea is also cool histology, and I think it's relatively easy. And it's going to be especially easy because for this version of the class, we're going to be doing it just looking at these pictures. And so, walking through these pictures, if I scroll up to the top, we've got a beautiful picture of a trachea up here. So, just to orient you a little bit, you've got the esophagus here in the back, and I do want you to be able to tell me where the esophagus is in this picture. That's why it's listed here on the list. And then, where we're going to spend most of our attention, though, is over here at the trachea. So, the trachea has a lumen. Lumen, again, is just a fancy term for the opening within a tube. That lumen is lined with a dark tissue that's easily identified in this picture. And like all luminal tissue, it's epithelium, but it actually is a pretty unique type of epithelium in that it's ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium that lines the inside of your trachea and actually continues down and lines the inside of your bronchi as well. So let's look at that layer a little bit closer, and we're going to go through the mucosa, submucosa, this cartilage ring, and the adventitia, because those are really the four layers of the trachea. So in the second picture here, you've got the mucosa, submucosa, what's called the cartilaginous layer here, but this is just our cartilage ring, just like this one out here. And then our fourth layer is the adventitia on the outside. So we're going to go through each one of these. So the mucosa is a general term. So when you hear somebody say mucosa, they're basically just saying the most internal layer of multiple tissue types that are on the inside of some tube in your body. We're going to see this in the digestive system and the respiratory system. So mucosa has multiple types of tissue within it. In this case, the mucosa is the most superficial layer, or the luminal surface, is ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, like I mentioned before. But like all epithelium, it has to have sort of a basement layer or something that actually connects the epithelium to the rest of the organ. And so this lighter area in here, this is not something you'll need to be able to pick out, but I just want to account for it as we go through these layers. This is areolar connective tissue, which is sort of gluing down the epithelium to the next layer that I do want you to know, which is the submucosa. And the submucosa is pretty easy to identify in these pictures because the submucosa has large collections of what are called seromucous glands. So they produce a sort of, it's not water and it's not really thick mucus. It's somewhere in between that. That's why it's seromucus. Sero means fluid or something that flows more like water, but mucus means the opposite. So it's sort of an in between, sort of like an oily secretion, I suppose, even though it's not actually oil. But these glands are found and occupy the majority of the space within the submucosa. So if your eyes are trying to pick something out that finds the submucosa, these glands are where you will look. Now, that's not all of what's in the submucosa. The submucosa continues from that layer of areolar connective tissue all the way to the cartilage ring, just like this picture illustrates. There's other things in here. You've got blood vessels, you've got nerves in here, you've got fat. That's what this is over here. So there are other types of tissue in there, but the thing to think of is the seromucous glands, and that's why they're highlighted as something you do need to know from your objective packet. And then the cartilaginous layer labeled here is equivalent or exactly the same as the C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage on your sheet right here. So that's an easy one to pick out. The reason it's easy is because hyaline cartilage, I know we haven't done this in a while, so maybe it's not that easy. Hyaline cartilage it does not have a high density of cells, so you don't see a ton of nuclei in here. And it just kind of has that stained glass, kind of a unique tissue type. And so that's why I say it's easy and that it's unique. And then the most external layer is called the adventitia. It's a layer of something that is closest under a microscope. It's a bunch of collagen. It's not classified as either dense, regular, or irregular. I'd say it's dense. Regular is actually more like what it is, but it's not. It's like irregularly arranged, dense, regular connective tissue, which sounds ridiculous, but it's like the outside of a sausage. it's this encasement that goes around the entire length of the trachea. So you can see it in the bigger picture up here, going around the outside. And this is new to us now because we haven't talked about this name, this adventitial layer, but it's sort of similar to the pericardium and the parietal pleura. If you've noticed, all of these organs we talk about always have an external layer around them that sort of separates them or puts them in their own little compartment, separate from the rest of the organs in your body, and it allows the organs to slide across each other with minimal friction. And that's the adventitious. So that's that fourth and most external layer around the trachea. All right, and that's it for the trachea. Not too bad. Pretty nice layering. As long as you got that layering down, this should be a piece of cake. All right, then moving into the lung, there's actually not that many terms in the lung. And for some reason on your curriculum packet, bronchus is not on there. And I don't know why, but we try to keep consistent with what we expect from students. So I've resisted the urge to add it onto your objective list, but I do want to point it out because just to review a little bit, remember the trachea goes down and it splits into primary bronchi, and then those split into secondary bronchi, and then those secondary bronchi all split into tertiary bronchi. So there's a lot of them in your lungs, and they're a really important structure. It's where the term bronchitis comes from, an inflammation of the bronchi. But what I want to point out in this picture is that a bronchus and the trachea are actually quite similar. They all have hyaline cartilage. They have the same internal ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. They have a submucosal layer. They have some glandular tissue, though not nearly as much as the trachea. But there's a lot of similarities there, I guess is my point. But I will not be asking you questions about the bronchus. I just wanted to introduce it here because I think ignoring it would have been sort of a disservice. Here's what you do need to know is it's the bronchioles. And bronchioles from a physiologic perspective are really important because the bronchioles are the only tubes in the lungs that change size. And by change size, I mean change diameter. They get narrower and they widen. Bronchioles do not have cartilage rings around them. The reason for that is that if you're a tube that you want to be able to shrink and expand, you don't want to have a rigid thing around it. You want something that's sort of floppy and can open and close, can dilate and constrict. And so you don't see the hyaline cartilage around a bronchiole. Instead, you see a lot of smooth muscle. You'll also see a pretty irregular border in any microscope slide you look at because bronchioles are pretty much all constricted in the microscope slides you're looking at. You'd have to like physically stretch them open to have it not be that way. And usually people don't do that in slides. So you get an appearance like this, a much more wobbly border than what you would see in a bronchus. So then moving further down, if we continue down the pathway of air, bronchioles do go into a respiratory bronchiole, then a terminal bronchiole, but histologically, we're not going to be picking those out. The next layer the next sort of stop on the pathway of air going from the environment into your lungs, we go from the bronchiole down into what's called an alveolar duct. And an alveolar duct is essentially you could think of it like a tube, the final tube that leads to each individual alveolus. And I think this picture does a nice job showing it. This would be really where the terminal bronchiole is, or that last layer that we even call a bronchiole. So air would flow down here and it would come in, and then in this case, it hits sort of a split and it travels down a common opening. But this is an alveolus right here and right here. So it's sort of an invisible line of where the alveolar duct ends and where an alveolus begins. And so on a microscope slide, what you're looking for is a common sort of linear white space. And those are your alveolar ducts. For example, over here, you don't have any like a common open space through here. These are all separate alveoli walled off from each other. But if you were looking under a microscope slide and you panned over here, you would notice, oh, here's a big continuous white space. And the borders of that continuous white space are actually made of alveoli. Whereas the borders of this white space here, that's not an alveolus. That's actually cuboidal epithelium. Actually, I know you can't see that, but that's what those are made of. And so that's kind of the special part of alveolar ducts themselves. They are the last to, before you actually would then sort of dead end into um, an alveolus itself. And then I actually cut alveolar sacs from the presentation, but haven't deleted the picture yet, so you can ignore this one. But we've already talked about alveolar sacs anatomically. Go back to the previous lecture to review that, but I won't be asking you about that histologically. So the lung is just this information right up here. And the last picture you'll be accountable for knowing is this one right here. So again, for all the histology, I'm going to take these pictures out. I'm going to cover up the labels and ask you questions about them. And that is it for respiratory anatomy.